Let's talk about status offenses or status offenders. What they're called in New York as persons in need of supervision. And the point of this was to shield those considered status offenders from non-criminal behavior and the stigma attached to juvenile delinquents or delinquent behavior. So let's be a little bit more specific. In juvenile cases, a status offense involves conduct that would not be a crime if it were committed by an adult. So in other words, the actions are considered to be in violation of the law only because of the youth's status as a minor. And some common examples of status offenses include underage drinking, skipping school, violating curfew laws, and in an average year, approximately 20% of juvenile arrests involve status offenses. So I want to kind of expand on those a little bit more. So the kind of conduct that might constitute a status offense will vary from state to state, but the most common ones are truancy, skipping school, violating a city or county curfew, underage possession and consumption of alcohol, underage possession and use of tobacco, running away, and basically just ungovernability. They're beyond the control of their parents or their guardians. So those types of things would bring a minor in for status of PINs. For short, we call it PINs, persons in need of supervision. And as my slide says, the court can exercise control over these children who are not being cared for with this kind of status. And girls are more likely to be petitioned to the juvenile court or for PIN supervision for running away, while the males are violating the curfew laws. That seems to be what the research says. And how states handle these offenses vary, of course, from state to state. Traditionally, status offenses were handled exclusively through the juvenile justice system. But in the 1960s and 70s, many states began to view status offense violations as a warning signal that a child needed better supervision or some other type of assistance to avoid future run-ins with the law. So this view is grounded in fact, by the way. Research has linked these status offenses to later delinquency. So that's a linked fact. So for the most part, the state's goals in dealing with status offenses became threefold: to preserve families, to ensure public safety, and to prevent young people from becoming delinquent or committing crimes in the future. And in this vein, the 1974 Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act emphasized deinstitutionalization of status offenses. This meant giving the prosecutors more broad discretion to divert status offenses cases away from the juvenile court and toward other government agencies that could better provide services to at-risk juveniles. Here in New York, we have the probation department has a branch that is strictly for PINs. So that's where they go first. They don't go to court. It doesn't get filed in court unless they don't do what they're supposed to do relative to PIN supervision. But I'll get there. I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So by diverting a case before a delinquency petition was filed, it also allows a young person to avoid that delinquent label. So some believe that label itself will impede a juvenile's chances for rehabilitation. And in 1997, only 1 in 5 status offense cases were formally processed by the courts, and even fewer status offense cases actually made it to juvenile court in the first place. And that's because law enforcement officers are less likely to refer status offense cases to juvenile court compared to delinquency cases, which are violations of the law, of the criminal statute law that anyone, even an adult, can commit. So of those status offense cases that do get referred, 94% involve liquor law violations, by the way. Possession and consumption. Today, most states refer to status offenders as children or juveniles in need of supervision or services or care. A few states designate some status offenders as dependent or neglected children. Here, we call them persons in need of supervision. And they give responsibility for these young people over to the state welfare programs. Like I said, here it's not the social services for PINs, it is the probation department for PINs, but it differs from state to state. States' approach on status offenses differs. In some states, a child who commits a status offense may end up in juvenile court. In other states, the child welfare agency is the first to deal with the problem. Some states have increased the use of residential placement or offenders, and others emphasize community-based programs. But in all states, if informal efforts and programs fail to remedy the problem, then the young minor will end up in a juvenile court. So penalties, status offenses. For juveniles who do end up in the juvenile court over a status offense, the kinds of penalties the court may impose vary, again, from state to state, but common penalties are suspending a driver's license if they're old enough to drive, requiring the juvenile to pay a fine or what's called restitution if it involved some sort of damage or owed money for something, ordering the juvenile to attend counseling or education programs. Sometimes community service is involved. If a juvenile violates a court order, most courts have the authority to order them to be detained or secured in a facility. Some states require juveniles' parents to attend counseling sessions or parenting classes as well, and we do that here in New York. A number of states have changed their way that they handle status offenses. I am not super familiar with Maine, Delaware, and Idaho, except that the fact they've tried to eliminate it. I would imagine that eliminate status offenses altogether. I don't think they have. I still believe all states recognize the status offense laws. I think eliminating it altogether would cause problems for the young folks. Nonetheless, if it's a serious offense, it may be transferred to even an adult court. They call that waiver, by the way, when a case gets transferred. We'll talk more about the court system in detail. And efforts have been made to remove those non-serious offenses from agencies of justice, i.e. Department of Social Services. So we'll see how these reform things, plays out. I want to talk about specifically curfew violations. They don't really expand on I thought I had a slide on the curfew violations. I do, but let me review this future of the status offense concept. Some juvenile judges believe that reducing judicial authority over children will limit juvenile court jurisdiction to hard court offenders. That's a pretty accurate understanding. That's really what the courts want to do, especially the courts here in New York and the ones that I have practiced before, was to make sure that the juvenile courts are dealing with the hardcore offenders. A lot of experts find that these status offense laws, the curfew, the truancy, and the using of alcohol are too draconian and results in nearly 10,000 youths being confined annually. You can be confined. I've been involved in cases where a judge did incarcerate a very young person for skipping school too many times. We're going to talk about truancy. That's why I want to talk about curfew and truancy. But if you get rid of them, I think the issue becomes then you don't catch problems early, right? The research has shown that if children who do these acts, these drinking underage, smoking underage, curfew violations, truancy, don't get some assistance now, that they will offend. That's what the research says. So, but if we do away with it, then where do we go? So, I want to talk curfew. Curfew violations have been the subject of controversy. The curfew laws, they're established locally by cities or counties, and typically they prohibit the young people under the age of 18, usually from being in a public place during certain hours, and the standard certain hours are between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. And most curfew ordinances contain exceptions for things like to travel to and from work or to and from school events. But for the most part, the local bodies enact these curfews. We do have some around in the local villages here. But there has been challenges against these curfew laws, strictly on the basis that they violate First Amendment rights to free speech and association. But there was a case out of the city of Rochester, and as a result of this, the New York Court of Appeals struck down the law as unconstitutional. But there are certainly a number of other curfew ordinances that have been upheld, and I don't know what the language was that shot that particular case down, but courts do look at curfew as a form of First Amendment right to associate. Truancy. This is not in the book, but I still think it's important. Skipping school. A minor is considered truant if he or she skips school without a valid excuse and without the knowledge of a parent or guardian. And states and school districts, they have different standards as to how many absences are required before a student is deemed truant. In some states, the number is 3, and others is as many as 18. But the reality is schools are usually the first ones to enforce this truancy law, and even have the authority to refer truancy cases, truancy cases to juvenile court when necessary. It's usually the school that gets involved, and the schools around here are very involved with truancy laws. The police officers have the legal power to detain a truant child who is outside of school grounds. Many states also hold parents accountable for their children's truancy, where they impose fine or even jail time on the parents who fail to ensure that their children are in school. So truancy is very, very important, and it accounts for the majority of status offense cases in the juvenile system, alongside the alcohol use. And studies have shown a strong link between truancy and future delinquency, not to mention difficulty in school. And we've already talked about that, how children are affected in school. So for this reason, many states, counties, and schools really crack down on truancy. Disciplining the parents, there are some states, like I just mentioned, who fine the parents. And every state has some sort of laws regarding parents' liability, or should the parents be disciplined for the acts of their children. Do they contribute to the youth's behavior? What if they can't control them? Courts are prone to make the parents pay for out-of-placement of the home, pay for court fees, pay for restitution if there's somebody's owed money as a result of the child's conduct. Criminal liability, you cannot impose criminal liability, like arresting the parent, unless they've encouraged the behavior that the children is participating in. Then it could lead to a criminal charge. But if it's unbeknownst to them, or they just might not be able to control the child. As civil liability, there's civil liability that exists. An injured party may sue parents for damage caused by the child. So that can happen as well. So sometimes the parents can be on the hook for their child's conduct. So that wraps up the discussion for Chapter 1. There are a few assignments, and remember to take a look and read through the New York State Family Court link that I have up on Moodle.